Rabbi Aaron Leibowitz, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
It's my pleasure, Scott. Happy to be here.
Let's start off by talking about the kashrut arm of Halacha Prenup, which was designed to break the Rabbanut's hold on kashrut. Now, as far as I understand it, that organization has actually divided. Now, I believe it's part of Tzohar. You can tell me if I'm wrong about that. But let's start off by asking about what I want to start off by asking why you created this organization dealing with kashrut. We'll deal with other issues soon, but what problems were you trying to solve initially?
So our work in kashrut was really where we, I suppose, cut our teeth, so to speak, and learned what it was that we were looking to become. Although we made an exit from kashrut, and what was called Hashgacha Pratit today is called Tzohar Pikuach Mazon. It's being run by Tzohar. At the time, and we're talking about 2011, 2012, I was a local neighborhood activist in Yerushalayim. I was the rabbi of a shul. I was a Rosh Yeshiva, and I was dealing with neighborhood issues. And I discovered a coffee shop in our neighborhood which claimed they were kosher, but for some reason they refused to work with the Rabbanut. And I began to sit down and have conversations with them, which really grew out of a communal need, a communal desire to connect with this great new coffee shop, which was the place to be in the neighborhood. What I discovered was that the kosher supervision of the Rabbanut in Yerushalayim had a terrible reputation. I discovered restaurants. This particular cafe introduced me to restaurant owners who had struggled with price hikes, who had struggled with strong-arming behaviors by mashgichim, who had struggled with mashgichim taking food without asking permission, and also some restaurants where the mashgichim did not show up. Now, after researching this for a while, I discovered that actually the state comptroller, Mevaker HaMedina, had published a couple of reports on the Rabbanut of Yerushalayim. But I suggested to this coffee shop, how about, I'm a rabbi in the community. My congregants would like to frequent your simple coffee shop establishment. How about if I give it hashgacha? I was also teaching, at that time, I was teaching Isser V'Heter. I was teaching a group of young rabbinic students the laws of kashrut. And I was like, this is the perfect field work that I can do with them. It only took a few short months, first of all, to discover that kashrut is not a homework assignment for a yeshiva bacher. It's a professional, kosher supervision is a professional pursuit. And I found some seasoned professionals in the kashrut industry to mentor those first steps. But 3 months later, we had 4 restaurants under our supervision. We had hired a mashgicha, and that was also one of the unique things that we did. We hired a woman to serve in the role of mashgichat kashrut, who had been trained, interestingly enough, by Emunah women who had just finished a course for mashgichat kashrut. And the Rabbanut weren't hiring these newly trained professionals. And to make a long story short, it was actually Rachel Azaria, who at that point was a city councilwoman in Jerusalem and afterwards became a Chavrat Knesset, who pointed out that this was really a national issue and not a local issue, and helped us raise the first funds to turn it into a project. 6 years later, we were in 5 different cities in Yerushalayim. We had 5 different cities in Israel. We had over 50 establishments, and at that point, after a second hearing in Supreme Court, we and Tzohar began to express interest. We transferred the kashrut over to Tzohar.
Let me ask about that. When you say hearings in the Supreme Court, the legal matter that you were contesting or you were being brought to court about, what is that legal matter?
So the way the monopoly over kashrut works, and still works today, although there have been some changes, some very good changes, but the way it works is it's a monopoly over the word kosher. You can't print the word kosher without a certificate from the Rabbanut. So what we did is we gave certificates which simply didn't use the word kosher. We said we certify that this establishment follows halacha as it pertains to food and its preparation. So we said kosher without using the K word or the chaf words, so to speak, and that was disputed in Supreme Court. We actually did not bring the case. We opposed the case. It was the Reform movement who brought the case before the Supreme Court. They actually recruited 2 of our restaurants as plaintiffs, and everything we did to get the restaurants to back off, we were unsuccessful. And they petitioned the court for the right to use the word kosher. And we told them that they're going to lose and they're going to make it worse. And they lost and they made it worse, because the Rabbanut's position was not only should the word kosher be prohibited, but anything that implies kosher should be prohibited. And the Supreme Court ruled like the Rabbanut, disqualifying all of our te'udot. And we had a very difficult 2 years where our te'udot were not being displayed in restaurants. And all we had was a list similar to what you'll find in Europe or other parts of the world. And we lost a lot of restaurants as a result of that. But in a beautiful sign of Hashgacha Pratit, we received a second, the Reform movement received a second hearing, and actually in the second hearing they lost again. They did not receive the right to use the word kosher, but that second court hearing, which was actually before 7 justices, which is very unusual, gave a green light to our workaround, and that's when Sohar decided to enter into the business.
Let me ask you, Rabbi Leibowitz, in terms of the Rabbanut's position and in terms of the Supreme Court's initial position, and perhaps latter position as well, I'm sure there's a lot of politics, but at least on the surface, or at least on some level, what's the logic behind saying that the Rabbanut has a monopoly on the K word, on the word kosher?
So it was clear that the court and the head of that particular triumvirate, is that the correct word? The 3 justices that sat on that panel, the head was Rubinstein, who's
tribunal, perhaps.
Tribunal, thank you. That's the sign of someone who made Aliyah when he was 16. Is fluent English, but a limited vocabulary. So the head of the court, the head of that tribunal was Rubinstein, and he clearly felt, and 2 of the justices felt very clearly that it was in the interest of the kosher consumer that kashrut be regulated, and that was the purpose of the law. Our counterclaim was that the Rabbanut doesn't represent the kosher consumer. The Rabbanut represents the ultra-Orthodox community. It's controlled by the ultra-Orthodox community, and that relates to the work that we're doing today. That the Rabbanut Harashit L'Yisrael, which is supposed to serve all of Am Yisrael in Israel, and some would say internationally, is actually an interest group. It actually represents and is controlled by a very narrow interest group who have a very extreme and fundamentalist interpretation of the boundaries of halacha. Much more conservative with a small c than your average Orthodox Israeli, certainly than your average modern Orthodox Israeli.
Okay, now, just to make sure I understand, there already have been for many years other kashrut organizations outside the purview of the Rabbanut, the various badatz organizations, which put their hechsherim on all sorts of restaurants and products. Tell me if I'm correct. Is the big difference here that a badatz has to use their hechsher in addition to the Rabbanut's hechsher, as opposed to instead of it, whereas Hashgacha Pratit was going and bypassing the Rabbanut and not also having a Rabbanut hechsher? Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. You can't use the word kosher without a Rabbanut certificate, but once you have that certificate, you can bring in another agency. Now, the irony of this situation is that we know that reliable kashrut over time can only be maintained in a competitive environment. Reliable and effective kashrut. The irony is that the Haredi community have developed their own private market of a higher level of kashrut, which is competitive. It's competitive in pricing, it's competitive in standards, it's competitive in reliability, and yet they maintain a stranglehold over the basic level of kashrut. And many of them won't even eat the food that's produced in those places. So they know full well that competition is good for kashrut. If competition was not good for kashrut, they would not be allowing it in their own courts to meet their own needs. What we really set out to do was to build a competitive market in basic level kashrut, that kashrut without any chumras, without any leniencies either, uncalled for leniencies. But it should be a base level kashrut. There should be a competitive market where the consumer can determine who they want to rely on. I would say, first of all, the Rabbanut have made significant improvements over the last 5 or 6 years, which our detractors often point out. What they miss is that many of those improvements were made because of the threat that we created, and because of the noise and the story that was told. In addition, the former Ministry of Religion, Matan Kahana, did succeed in pushing through the first step of his reform. So there is competition now in the basic kashrut market. The competition is between the local religious councils. What they did is until this reform began, you could only get a kosher certificate from your local religious council, which meant there was no competition. Today, a restaurant in Yerushalayim who's not happy with his mashkiach can go, for instance, to Moitza Datit of Gush Etzion and ask them to supervise his establishment. So there's been a significant improvement. Unfortunately, it's still only Moitza Datiot that can give kashrut, and that also has to change.
Okay. And just one last question about kashrut before we move on to other topics. Did the Supreme Court deal with the issue that there is, as you mentioned, corruption throughout many of the supervisors when they, as you said, take their own food or perhaps demand money? I don't know exactly what is done. That's what you said before. Did that matter to them when the court said, well, this is in the interest of the consumer?
There's a previous Supreme Court ruling on the conflict of interest, which is created when the restaurant pays the mashgiach and not the kashrut agency. Under the Rabbanut system, the mashgiach is actually employed by the restaurant. And Supreme Court ruled years before we even brought our case to the court that Rabbanut has to resolve that issue and find a different system. And the Rabbanut dragged its feet for well over a decade and did not make any changes in that regard. The case which we were involved in, the case which revolved around our teudot, did not relate to the issues of corruption. And indeed, the Rabbanut have this recurring chorus. Of course, there's a lot to fix. Of course, it's not perfect. Of course, we have, they don't even deny that the system is broken. And the real question is not, do you admit it needs to be fixed, but what have you done to actually change it? And the answer is very little.
Just one last question. I know I said I was going to move on, but is that still the case right now, that the restaurants pay the mashgiach directly rather than paying the rabbinate? Because that seems to be ripe for corruption.
Yeah. So that's actually changed over the last couple of years, but it's a change in process. Again, it's an implementation of a ruling which was a long time coming. Right now, there are manpower firms, what we call here chavrot koach adam, which specialize in paying the mashgichim and pooling the money from the restaurants for the service, so that there's been a kind of one level of separation, but clearly it creates a bureaucratic nightmare and also very little ability to address the quality of service. In other words, the manpower firm is not the one who's supervising the mashgiach, who's actually making sure that he's doing a good job. So, in Sohar, which follow the model that we developed 100%, the mashgichim are paid by the kashrut organization, the same way as the OU or the Chavkei or any reputable kashrut agency. And in that way, the kashrut agency, first of all, can adopt a service-oriented relationship towards the establishment. It can adopt a transparency and commitment to high standards when addressing the consumer's needs, and it can develop a professional workforce who are employed by the same entity who pay them and provide them with their professional know-how and support.
It just seems strange to me that the rabbinate would somehow resist that, meaning even from the perspective of the local rabbinate of a given city, if they have a choice of the restaurant paying their mashgichim directly versus paying them and then they pay the mashgiach, I would assume they'd prefer the latter. And obviously that's less corrupt. It's a win-win. I'm not quite sure why they would resist anything to do with changing it that way.
The implication is that they don't have the infrastructure to support that kind of a financial burden because it's huge. But I find that questionable. It's not really a compelling argument. I think what's much more likely is that it's been very convenient for them. See, the kashrut, it's important to appreciate the interest the Rabbanut has in the kashrut industry is not a financial interest, a direct financial interest. It's because it provides endless jobs with very low demand, very low requirements, both in terms of skill level and actually in terms of performance. In other words, there are thousands of yeshiva bachrim and yeshiva students who are employed as mashgichei kashrut and get their paycheck for a job which requires very little training and has very little oversight in terms of performance. That's what they don't want to lose.
Why do they care? I mean, seriously, they're not an employment agency. Why do they care if lots of yeshiva bachers have jobs that way?
Because you're treating the Rabbanut as if it exists in a vacuum and doesn't represent the broader social and political agenda of the Haredi community. The Haredi community as a community, the leadership of the Haredi community are very concerned with the potential, with the parnasah of their constituents, and this is not this. I mean, it's a drop in the bucket in terms of the needs of the whole community, but it's a tremendous resource to provide people who have relationships. There's a lot of cronyism that goes on. And one more thing which I should say, I'm sharing information which is public record in terms of the corruption, but it's important to be aware that that these religious councils are local, and some cities are better than others. So it's by no means meant to color all of the rabbanut or all of the mashgichim negatively. It's speaking about a phenomenon that is very, very widespread and needs to be stopped.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to chupot, which is an arm of your organization, Halacha Prenup, that arranges weddings outside the purview of the rabbanut. Once again, the same question I asked about kashrut, I'll ask about chupot. What was the reason that this was necessary? And I realize it's a very big question.
So we were actually chafing at the bit to begin working in marriage during the kashrut years. And because it was clear to us and also to our board that it would be more controversial, we were holding back, which was one of the reasons the opportunity to make the exit to Tzohar was so attractive to us, because we were ready to move on to something which is a much more, which is higher stakes. And yeah, we've noticed that pun, that the pun that's there, higher stakes than kashrut. But we also felt that the pain point was deeper and was doing more damage to my mind, to Torah and to Hashem's name. The fact that in Israel, an Israeli citizen cannot marry whoever he wants, however they want, is a travesty, which certainly to the American intuition is very clear. I mean, imagine if you were a citizen of a country and you were told, no, you may not get married here to anyone. And if you choose to get married, you have to do it our way. So marriage is a very, very personal moment. It's also a very public and social institution. And those two facts create a tension between a person's individual vision and a person's individual rights. And also the desire of society has to regulate what it means to be married and who is married and who is not. The fact that Israel has basically perpetuated an Ottoman law the law of marriage in Israel was written during the Ottoman rule of Israel, and it gave the religious institutions the authority over marriage in their respective religions. And because Israel adopted that law, the Rabbanut HaRashit, the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, have full authority over the marriage of Jews in Israel, only of Jews, because that Ottoman law says each religion, its own religious institutions have the authority. So it raises a range of issues. On the most basic level, and the issue I alluded to already, if you have somebody who's an Israeli citizen and is not recognized by the rabbinate as being Jewish, he is not allowed to get married in Israel to another Jew. So you have right now close to 500,000 immigrants from the former Soviet Union, many of whom are not halachically Jewish, and many of whom are halachically Jewish, but have not established that they're halachically Jewish to the standards that the Rabbanut requires. And the only way they can get married is a civil marriage abroad, which is unconscionable to my mind. But that's not the only issue. There are other issues. There are Orthodox converts converted by modern Orthodox Batei Din, who the Rabbanut doesn't recognize as being kosher Batei Din, who also cannot get married in Israel. There are couples of, let's say, a Kohen and a Grusha, who a divorcee, a Kohen and a divorcee, or a Kohen and a convert, who are not marriageable according to halacha, and who we would also not perform the wedding, but who want to get, one of the potential heterim from, let's say, a modern Orthodox rabbi, a less strict rabbi, to get married, and that avenue isn't open to them. There are such avenues which can question the Kohen status of the man who is a Kohen, or who can question the conversion status or the divorce status of the woman who's converted. And these are tshuvot which have been written classically by great poskim in the past. When you have a situation where they are kshurim ba'avotot ahava, where a couple are already in love and are going to get married, there is a tradition in the halacha to do everything we can to find a way to permit them, because they're going to get married anyway. But of course, that's not the Haredi, it's not the ultra-Orthodox culture to, in any category, do everything you can to permit something. On the contrary, the cultural milieu, certainly when it comes to the general public, it's very different, by the way, when it comes to someone they know, or a family member, or somebody who knows the right postgame. But when it comes to the attitude towards the general public, the attitude is chumrah, is to be strict. In addition, there are many issues which have to do with women's rights and women's issues, where the Rabbanut have been very reluctant, if not obstinate, in addressing. So, for instance, there is a document called the Halacha Prenup to prevent get refusal. Get refusal is a misnomer; it should be called get extortion. And there is that such documents exist and are even required, I believe, by the RCA, or at least almost required by the RCA. The Rabbanut refuses to allow them. There are.
Well, Rabbi Leibowitz, I don't think they don't refuse to allow them. If my daughter got married, she had a halacha prenup, and as far as I know, she's registered without a problem.
That's true, but if she would have raised it with the registrar and the Rabbanut, they would have given her a hard time. Okay. In other words, the halacha prenup can be signed outside. The only exception to that rule is tzohar, and I think we should speak about tzohar at some point, because tzohar is a unique situation when it comes to marriage. But the Rabbanut are on the record that they don't recognize the validity of them, and they view that them as being negative, and it's been discussed. Now, maybe I should make clear. To my mind, for an Orthodox rabbi to perform a wedding without a halachic prenup is malpractice. Certainly, if he hasn't very carefully explained to the woman kiddushin, what halachic marriage means to her future. If there hasn't been full disclosure, and I would say even with full disclosure, I for one would never perform a chuppah without a halachic prenup, because I don't want to have this dynamic of get extortion on my conscience in the future. I also don't believe a young couple are positioned to make that decision themselves. I believe that we as society should make it for them, and it should be our generation's equivalent of ketubah.
Can I ask you a question about this then? You've said a lot that's very, very important. And when you said at the very beginning, I found it fascinating that you felt the current system is against the Torah, the way that it's currently being set up, the fact that so many couples cannot marry in Israel. I'm curious how far you would take that, because you mentioned, for example, a Kohen and a divorcee, that there are halachic mechanisms, if they're going to get married anyway, for us to find a way to b'diavad after the fact, or before after the fact, so to speak, to find a way to allow them to get married anyway, since it's going to happen.
In some cases.
In some cases, right. There are mechanisms that are potentially there. But on the other hand, you mentioned the Olim from Russia, and there are many people there who are not halachically Jewish, although they consider themselves Jewish. They serve in the Israeli army. As far as they're concerned, they're 100% Jewish, though I'm not talking about people who are in doubt. I mean, people who genuinely are not Jewish. We know they had a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother. So do you believe they should get married according to the laws of the state of Israel to a Jew? Should that be permitted also?
So first of all, they are getting married according to the laws of the state of Israel to Jews. They're simply traveling to Cyprus, doing a civil marriage in Cyprus, and coming back to Israel and registering. I think there's a huge difference between chuppah v'kiddushin, the halachic institution of marriage, and the civil institution of marriage. The civil institution of marriage is a civil right which every citizen deserves, and the fact that we have created this misleading fiction that there is no civil marriage in Israel by requiring people to get on a plane. And by the way, today they don't even have to get on a plane. Today they can get on Zoom to Utah,
right,
and have a civil marriage on Zoom in Utah. It's a disgrace to Israel. And when I said before that it's a chilul Hashem, it's a disgrace to God, it's because the reason I feel it's a disgrace to God is it paints the Torah and God as being obsessed with controlling the lives of individuals who are choosing to opt out. And I think that it paints first of all, it paints God as if God is sitting in Shamayim and wringing his hands and saying, what are we going to do about these Olim from, the Olim are here and they are citizens of Israel. Now, whether you agree with the laws that gave them that citizenship, that's something which is under public debate now, and that's a separate issue. But for us to be holding on to this stranglehold, lest they do in front of an Israeli clerk what they're already doing in front of a clerk in Utah, and somehow saying that this brings God some kind of nachat, some kind of pleasure, I think is wrong. And
well, wouldn't some people argue, perhaps, again playing some sort of devil's advocate over here, that it still acts as a deterrent? Perhaps now that things have changed and they can just get on Zoom and go to Utah virtually, things might be different. But when the law was that the best they could do was go to Cyprus or some other country and come back with a marriage certificate, perhaps someone would say that before they ever fall in love or date someone who's halachically not Jewish, that would serve as a deterrent. I realize once they're already in love, it might be too late. But in advance, perhaps a non-religious Israeli would say, yes, but I want to marry a Jew. And now, if we say legally it's allowed, that deterrent has been removed.
So I would say anyone asking that question is a little disconnected from the reality on the ground in Israel. And I think for a lot of the listeners to this podcast, it's important to clarify. We're not talking here about 500,000 Russians who barely speak Hebrew who just got off the plane. We're talking here about 3 generations of Aliyah and their children and their grandchildren who are fluent Hebrew speakers, who are growing up in the Israeli school system, who are serving in the army, who very often don't even discover that their Jewish status is in question until they get to the point of marriage, when they've already fallen in love with somebody and they're already dating them. I do not believe that ever in the history of the state of Israel has there been a single Israeli who has decided not to date someone because they will not be allowed to marry them in Israel. I thought that's not how people work. And the bottom line is that is that this issue is already here. It's not reversible, and I think that the best that we can hope to do, first of all, is identify those olim who are halachically Jewish, identify them now, and also identify those who are not halachically Jewish, create an alternative form of marriage for them, an alternative of civil marriage. And I am for civil marriage in Israel. I just want to make that clear. That's not, by the way, a formal position of chupot. That's of hashgacha pratit. That's my position. We have different opinions on this in the organization. I am for civil marriage, and I think that we need to create an institution of civil marriage. And I also think we need to create a more accessible path to conversion. I think that many of these Russian immigrants or children of immigrants from Eastern Europe, many of them would be completely open to conversion. They're just not willing to lie in beitin, that they're going to be fully observant, and it's a huge machloket. There's a big halachic conversation around whether full acceptance of Torah of mitzvot is required for conversion. And here I think that there's room in Israel to revisit that, and I think that it should be revisited. By the way, even those who are converting in the Israeli rabbinic courts, many of them don't intend to keep Torah mitzvot, and the dayanim who convert them also know it, and they're converting them based on a halacha that says that dvarim shebalev and dvarim, that things that are in your heart, all that matters is that they say. And that also to me is a chilul Hashem. I mean, imagine the experience of this convert who's being told, with a wink and a nudge, just go in and say you're going to keep it and we'll convert you. And that's the difference between the person who halachically were allowing to get married and the person who are not. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I know that your colleague, Rabbi Chuck Davidson, has dealt a lot with the conversion issue in particular. I probably should get him on the podcast again. It's been a few years. I know that's an area of particular expertise of his. I want to ask you about something you mentioned a couple minutes ago when you said that the Chief Rabbinate is working with a Haredi mindset, which is in general much more machmir, much stricter when it comes to a lot of these issues. As I understand it, and I don't know the history extremely well, but before the election of the first Rabbi Lau about 30 years ago, a little less than that, the rabbinate was generally run by more dati le'umi people. Not necessarily so, but for example, Rav Avraham Shapiro was his predecessor. People were often more in the dati le'umi world or associated with Merkaz Harav, associated with national religious institutions on some level, at least as I understand it, until that changed in the early 90s. So first of all, you can tell me if that's true or not. And if it is true, does that mean that some of the problems with chumrah, with strictness that have come up are products of the past 30 years, or have they been a problem since 1948?
I don't identify the difference between a machmir or a mekil, a strict or a lenient rabbinate, as paralleling the lines of modern Orthodoxy or Haredi, or Dati Le'umi, religious Zionist, and Haredi, ultra-Orthodox. I don't think that those are the lines. I think that those lines relate to, they can relate sometimes to stringency and halacha, but I think that there are Haredi poskim who are extremely lenient. There were ultra-Orthodox poskim who were extremely lenient. Rav Ovadia Yosef was a good example. In the US, Rav Moshe Feinstein was a good example. And the reason they were mekil is because they understood that there's a difference between their role as the rabbi of their community and let's say perhaps the leader of their family and their own halachic decisor, and their role as a gadol in Am Yisrael, a great leader in Am Yisrael. A gadol in Am Yisrael, and this was the greatness both of Rav Ovadia and Rav Moshe. They understood that Am Yisrael were facing challenges which required leniencies. By the way, sometimes they actually required stringencies, which were leniencies. For instance, Rav Moshe Feinstein's paskening that every reform and conservative wedding is not kosher by definition was a chumrah, which was a kula to solve. It solved many huge issues for American Jewry. So that vision is what I think would make somebody potentially fit to be a Rav Rashi Yisrael, because and there's a huge difference, for instance, between my own practice, and I'm also the rabbi of a shul, If someone in my shul would come to me and ask me a question pertaining to their wedding, I might give them a different answer than the answer I give a couple that I'm serving in chuppot. I think that when you're serving a non-Orthodox community, and I think many rabbis in North America who serve communities with large non-Orthodox memberships would appreciate this. When you're serving a non-Orthodox community, it's imperative that you be as lenient as possible in order to make Torah relevant to them. In other words, even if you think that a machmir position might be more intellectually honest or called for or praiseworthy or holy, when somebody who's not committed to the system is asking you a shaila, what's behind that question is not only can you be lenient on this point, what's behind that question is Torah relevant to me as well? Can it be relevant to me as well? And that to me is the big misfire of the Chief Rabbinate. So I don't imagine that the solution will be a chief rabbi with a kippah sruga. There are plenty of chief rabbis with a kippah sruga who don't have this kind of a vision. Well, and I also believe that there are Haredi rabbis, there are ultra-Orthodox rabbis who do appreciate this perspective. And I've spoken to many, and many of them, by the way, give us a pat on the back for the work that we're doing, because they're also heartbroken. I'll give you an example. Rav Amsalem, who was a student of Rav Ovadia Yosef and certainly identifies with the Haredi worldview, is aghast at where the Chief Rabbinate have taken halacha.
Okay. I'm curious, a lot of the work that you're doing with chuppot, as I understand it, is criminal, technically. Is that true, or am I wrong? Like, it's technically against the law.
Okay, so I'm going to modify your sentence. I will say a certain amount, or even a small amount, of the work we're doing in chuppot is challenging the law.
Okay, can you explain what you mean by that?
And maybe outside the law. So what the law says, the law, by the way, is written terribly, and that's the saving grace. It was written, it's written like it was written 15 minutes before they voted on it on the Knesset floor, and that might be what actually happened.
It wouldn't be a shock.
It's actually slipped into a different tikkun chok, a different amendment there was an amendment that was going through to allow Tzohar to function as a rabbinate clearinghouse countrywide. It's called Chok Tzohar. That's what it's coined. This was 2013, and now maybe I'm wrong with the year. Don't hold me to that year.
Okay.
And when Chok Tzohar passed, they slipped in a clause. The law itself said that any rabbinate can perform weddings for anyone in the state of Israel. And because Rav Stav is the head of Shoham, and because Rav Riskin was the chief rabbi of Efrat, so they had two moitzot datiyot, two religious councils, and this allowed Tzohar to do weddings anywhere in Israel. They slipped in a clause that said,
you mean effectively as an extension of those local communities?
Effectively as an extension of those local communities, and allowing Tzohar to do the extremely important task of making a user-friendly experience for the non-religious Israeli. Now, at the same time, they are rabbinut weddings, and they're not allowed to deviate from rabbinut policies, which explains why chuppot is needed. In other words, it's a friendlier experience. It's user-friendly. It's done worlds. It's a kiddush Hashem, but it doesn't solve the hardcore issues. They slipped in a clause. The clause says any couple who get married with an Orthodox wedding, Kedat Moshe Yisrael, and don't concern themselves with registering said wedding. That's literally what it says. V'lo da'ag l'rishum.
Okay.
It's punishable by 2 years in prison for the rabbi and the couple. Nowhere does it define what it means to concern oneself with registration. Nowhere does it define who is authorized to register a wedding. These things are all left. So they tried to create this law. What happened is a couple of years ago, I think let's go back like 5 years, they tried to investigate a conservative rabbi in Haifa, Dubi Chayun. He's a conservative rabbi, but like many conservative rabbis, he's mostly halachic, and his weddings are probably kosher. And he was doing private weddings, and the police knocked on his door at 5 a.m. and told him to present himself at 10 in the local station for investigation. Well, they didn't know Rav Dubi very well. I didn't know him then either. Since then, I've met him. I mean, they knocked on his door at 6 a.m. By the 7 a.m. news. It was on the news that morning.
He was ready for this, in other words.
It was the front pages in the newspapers. And by 10 a.m., the state attorney had a written position that law is not enforceable, and the investigation was canceled. He gave the directive to cancel the investigation. So back to the specifics of your question. The couples whose weddings we perform who are not eligible for marriage in Israel, those are for sure legal. And that's about a third of the weddings that we do. The weddings of couples that we do who in the chuppah do things that are permitted by, let's say, a liberal Masada Kiddushin, but would be prohibited by the Rabbanut. For instance, we have women performing chuppot, women who have been ordained by, let's say, Yeshivat Maharat or Midrashat Lindenbaum or Beit Midrash Harel. There are ordained women, rabbinic figures. We've chosen to call them Rabbaniyot, but the title, I'm sure you've had a podcast on this particular question already in your series. The Rabbanut would not recognize those weddings. And also, more than half our couples, in addition to a chuppah wedding, register abroad with a civil marriage. They do a civil marriage abroad and they register, which fulfills the requirement of the law. They concern themselves with getting their marriage registered. They just didn't do it in the usual way. So there's a small amount of the weddings that we do, which theoretically could fall under this clause, which the state attorney has already said is not enforceable. We'd like to see them try and throw a rabbi or a couple in jail for getting married. Maybe if there's a clause, if they pass a law that says that the Knesset can overturn decisions by the Supreme Court, it'll become more of a complex question. Right now, it's not really a complex question. The other thing which I would say is that by kashrut also, for years we were accused of acting illegally, and then when it reached Supreme Court, it became clear it was legal. We did have a short period where we were receiving letters from the tax authorities, questioning our tax exempt status, because we're engaged in activity which is questionable in terms of its legality. And after 3 letters back and forth, they confirmed our tax exempt status. So even the tax authorities were convinced that what we're doing is kosher.
Okay, let me ask about the Rabbanut itself, because organizations like Rav Stav Sohar or by Seth Farber's Etim organization work with the Rabbinate. They work alongside them, trying to work together to reform certain elements of it, but they don't try to bypass the Rabbinate. Chupot and Hashgacha Pratit is clearly working by bypassing the Rabbinate and doing something outside of its purview. So my question really is the Rabbinate redeemable, or do you feel that this is the future, everyone should try and go outside the Rabbinate? Do you think that we should try to work with the Rabbinate in general, or should we avoid that altogether and simply work outside as much as possible to undermine it?
So I think that Zohar have provided a really important revolution and a really important step in their time. I think it's time to go further. Etim are crucial because you still have plenty of people who want to work within the system, and you also have plenty of people who need to work within the system. And Etim are wizards at problem solving, and they've built, Rav Shaul has built tremendous inroads. And by the way, he's also a very vocal critic of all the same things that we criticize. I think what we have is a symbiotic relationship, both with Zohar and with Etim. Etim, by the way, I think would agree with that on the record. Zohar might not agree with that on the record, but Zohar refer couples to us. Zohar have couples who they cannot marry and they know are halachically marriageable, and they refer them to chupot. So I think each of these institutions has its place and has its time. The advantage of Hashgacha Pratit, of our Amuta, is because our modus operandi is to challenge, is to go out on a limb and challenge the establishment. We have much less to lose than Itim and SAR, which are built on a certain level of public legitimacy. But when you have that public legitimacy, you can't take controversial positions because it jeopardizes your standing. And I will say, many of the funders of Tzohar and of Itim fund Hashgacha Pratit as well. In other words, the appreciation is that this is a battle which needs to be addressed on all fronts. What all three of us agree on, by the way, both Tzohar and Itim and Hashgacha Pratit, is that the Rabbanut, as it appears today, is terribly broken.
Rabbi Leibowitz, what do you do when a couple comes to you, Hashgacha Pratit, to chupot, that you agree is halachically unable to get married? Let's say, for example, a Kohen and a divorcee, where you can't use one of the mechanisms to declare that he's not a Kohen, for example, or a couple that wants to intermarry. What do you advise them?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you I'll add a third group to that. If a gay couple comes to us,
that was my next question.
Married. Okay, so I mean, I tell them regrettably they're not eligible for chuppah v'kiddushin according to halachic standards, to our halachic standards. And I recommend that they speak with the conservative movement or the reform movement, or consider a civil marriage abroad. I also encourage them to consider the possibility of living as a couple under common law, which exists in Israel, what we call Yedu'im B'tzibur, which is an institution which gives them all the rights as a married couple. But it's clear that they're not. I think that it's an opportunity for a tremendous Kiddush Hashem, because when you reject someone, you can reject them in a way which makes them feel feel judged, or you can reject them in a way which makes them simply appreciate that what you offer is not for them. And I think it makes a huge difference.
That leads to an interesting question, Rabbi Leibowitz, because some people would say that, on the one hand, the importance of not judging somebody, the potential sanctification of God's name that comes from putting a positive face and not judging, could be counterbalanced by attempting to convince them don't intermarry. You're destroying a Jewish line. For example, let's say a couple is coming to you, one person is Jewish and the other person is not Jewish. Let's not even say that we're talking about a Russian who considers himself Jewish. Let's say it's somebody who is fully not Jewish and has no intention of being Jewish and doesn't identify as Jewish in any way. So there's no hope in the future of that person necessarily even converting. So to go and tell them, I'm not judging you, some people would say, of course we have to judge them and convince them, if we can, not to do it. How would you respond to that?
I think if someone came to me and one of them was practicing another religion or didn't identify as Jewish, then clearly I would try and open a deeper conversation and explore whether there was room to create a shift. I don't know if I would immediately try to create a shift, but explore whether there was room to create a shift. Either to reconsider the relationship or to consider conversion, sincere conversion, not just technical conversion. I think that when you're dealing with somebody who views themselves as being Jewish, but they're not halachically Jewish, the conversation there is a conversation about the potential for conversion, and that I always share with them. I tell them, I can introduce, if you're interested in converting and the reason you've decided not to is because of the stories you've heard about the Rabbanut, I can introduce you to private Batei Din, whether it's Gior Kahalacha or Ahavat Hager of Rav Amsalem, or Rav Chuck's private Beit Din, which does conversions. So there's certainly room for that. But I will say that I'm not looking to sour their encounter with Torah by making them feel like I have an agenda to proselytize or to reject.
I understand. I want to ask you a couple more questions. You mentioned before referring a couple to a non-Orthodox stream of Judaism. What's your feeling, Rabbi Leibowitz, about non-Orthodox weddings in Israel? Do you think that they should be allowed as well? And I mean beyond, obviously, I'm not speaking about what you're doing. I'm talking about a Reform rabbi having the right to marry a couple.
Yes, absolutely. My feeling that civil marriage should be allowed is actually looking for a mechanism where we can maintain some sort of registry of who's been married and how they've been married, because clearly if there are Reform and conservative weddings taking place in Israel, it's important to know who is married according to halacha and who's not married according to halacha. Having a record of who's married according to halacha would enable us to support the giving of a get if they get divorced, and prevent the potential for mamzerut in the future. Now, again, keep in mind, I don't really think that whether conservative or Reform weddings are happening in Israel is up to me. There are Reform weddings happening. By the way, there are Reform weddings and conservative weddings happening in Israel today, and they're actually legal. In other words, the only weddings that are questionable in terms of the legality are Orthodox weddings, Kedat Moshe Yisrael. So,
what do you mean by that? Why is that so?
The law, which I quoted earlier, makes very clear that it's only a halachically kosher wedding, which is punishable by 2 years in prison. Now, a conservative or Reform wedding won't be recognized, but it's not. But there's no clause that tries to render it illegal. And in some ways, some would say that it's preferable from a civil perspective to get married in a way which is clearly not Orthodox. Which is,
in other words, a non-halachic wedding is looked at as a type of tekes that has no legal validity or binding nature, and therefore, according to the law, they didn't do anything, and therefore nothing wrong happened, as opposed to an Orthodox wedding where there was actually a Kiddushi Kedat Moshe Yisrael, in which case you violated the law by doing it outside the purview of the rabbinate.
Correct. The other thing which I'll say is that there's also there's a huge revolution of Jewish identity going on in Israel, and of secular Jewish identity and re-engagement with Torah and Torah sources and learning and religion. Conservative and Reform Jews in Israel are going to shul on Shabbos. They're saying Shema. They're connecting. And when I understand that there are many who say, clearly I prefer a secular Israeli to a Reform Israeli, which is like the classic Haredi opposition to the Reform movement. To me, it's not so clear. It's not so clear that the embracing of secular culture, which you can find in places which are completely alienated from Torah and from Jewish identity, are better than what we're seeing today, which is a growing sense of Jewishness in the non-halachic Israeli circles.
I once heard or read that Rav Aaron Lichtenstein Zatzal wrote something along the lines of trying to combat the off-cited idea that, we just want Reform and conservative in America or anywhere else, not even in Israel, forget that, but anywhere, just to cease to exist. And he said, let's think about this logically. Again, I think he was speaking about the United States. If every conservative temple shut down tomorrow, would that be good or bad for Torah Judaism? Do we really think that all those members of those shuls will now start going to their local Orthodox shtibel, or will they simply be lost with no connection whatsoever? And he was obviously implying that the latter was more likely, in which case we have to understand that while we have serious disagreements with those movements, they're not coming empty-handed with nothing to offer, and their destruction, so to speak, would be beneficial. He's saying, on the contrary, it would not be, if I understood what he said correctly.
Yeah, I would say even more than that. There's a fear paradigm which dominates the Haredi worldview, and it's not coincidental, I think, that they're known as Haredim. They self-identify as Haredim because it connotes a Yirat Hashem, a fear of Yirat Shamayim, a fear of heaven, an awe of heaven. But I think that it also reveals a certain aspect of sacrilege, of kfira, in their worldview, in which somehow God needs the people to be the gatekeepers of the purity of his path, I think that it's a society which is feeling, which I have tremendous empathy for that segment of society. I think that first of all, I have a lot of appreciation for their authenticity, for their dedication, for their care, for their connection to learning, for their willingness to live, at least to be less consumer oriented. A lot of appreciation. But it's a community that's feeling besieged by Western culture and is hunkering down, and there's a lot of fear there, and that fear trickles into this worldview, which feels threatened by anybody who sees things differently than I do, as opposed to appreciating that part of believing in yourself is feeling confident and safe enough to engage with people who see things differently. And be willing to respect them and honor them, so that they will be open to hearing you and respecting and honoring you. If they don't receive respect, they're not going to give respect back. If they don't give respect back, they're not going to be open to hearing what it is that Torah has to offer them, and that's a huge loss.
Okay, this has been very interesting. Rabbi Leibowitz, one last question. If you could look into the future, 50 years into the future, and envision an ideal state of Israel vis-a-vis what you're doing now, vis-a-vis the rabbinate, how would you picture it? What would that state of Israel look like?
So I'm very pessimistic about there being any chance to fix the chief rabbinate from within. The political equations are such that the Haredi community will always be the ones who will gain control over religious issues. Israelis go to the polls on politics, on economics and security, and they don't go to the polls on religion and state issues, and the politicians know it, and the equations are such that the one community who do go to the polls on religious issues are the ultra-Orthodox community. So the political equations are not going to change. What I think can change is I think there could be a grassroots shift away from focusing on the power of that this monopoly gives the chief rabbinate, a sense that we shape our religious experience individually. These are things which to Americans are obvious, that we shape our religious experience on a communal level. I think that Israelis can be shifted towards appreciating that really we define our religious sensibilities and our ideals on a communal level. And I think that when things change on the ground, it creates the lens becomes different. The lens becomes different in the Knesset. The lens becomes different in the court. I think, my hope would be that either the chief rabbinate will be completely dismantled because it will be irrelevant, or perhaps better, there should be a symbolic institution similar to the presidency in Israel, of a chief rabbi who is a holder of a certain Jewish identity for the state, who serves at ceremonies and public events, who serves as a religious face of the country. We've had great statesmen for the Jewish people. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, or perhaps I should say Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was a great statesman for the Jewish people. I think if Israel had a Rav Rashi who appreciated that what Hashem needs and what Torah needs is a great statesman who can bring out the relevance of Torah and the beauty of Torah to the masses, and that halacha should be left on the communal level. There should not be legislation that is halachically driven, and I think that when we separate, that's a vision not of separating church and state, not of separating religion and state, but separating halacha and state. That, I think, is an admirable goal.
Well, Rabbi Aaron Leibowitz, it's been an honor to speak to you today, and I know you're doing such important work on behalf of Klal Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. So I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and explaining what you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.